Hello everybody, how's it going? Mork here, and today we'll be talking about the toughness skills in Mordheim Paramod and how I feel about them and stuff. So, I guess we can just get right into it. And I suppose the first question is gonna be about adrenaline rush right now. So, the thing about adrenaline rush, I feel like right now, currently, this skill is extremely overrated in the PvP community, I guess. Um, it's also like it's also like really good in like PvE as well. And what the skill does, like it enables like a lot of combos, right? And also like can fix your offensive points. If, for example, somebody reduces your offensive points, this skill also enables charging an enemy. If you have like a two-handed weapon, or if you're dual wielding, you can charge, you can then attack, and then you can attack again with Adrenaline Rush. Adrenaline Rush also like enables like some combos with like the special attacks, right? And this also allows an impressive with 9 OP to attack 5 times instead of 4 times. It also enables like 100 characters with a shield to attack 5 times instead of 4 times, and that's just heroes. And it also enables like henchmen to attack 3 times instead of 2 times. And that's kind of a huge deal, honestly. I think in a lot of cases, Adrenaline Rush is often a difference maker between like you being able to kill a unit or not. Um, with that said, I don't think it's like a sort of a thing that you put on every single character in your warband. Like I've seen sometimes people put this even on what do you call it? On like tanks, right? I feel like it is like dealing 30 damage to yourself doesn't really make sense for a tank character. Also, you don't necessarily need this for something like a support archer. You also don't necessarily need this for something like spellcasters, because spellcasters can just use what do you call it? Quick prayer or quick casting, to deal with things. Also, I've seen people use the skill a lot, and they would just use it to deal 30 damage to themselves, which is not really ideal. So with all this said, although this skill is kind of overrated, it's also incredibly good. So I think this should like easily go into the god tier, I think. So as for the mastery, so the mastery of Adrenaline Rush is a little bit different from the vanilla. In vanilla, Adrenaline Rush Mastery deals 60 damage and you get 3 offensive points. In Paramod, you still deal 30 damage to yourself and you get 2 offensive points instead. So like some people think that like the Mastery Adrenaline Rush is just not really good enough. I think it's actually like still pretty good. I would personally use this sort of a skill on what do you call them? On impressives. On impressives that want to use like some kind of like special attack. Or impressives that want to charge the enemy, right? So like for 3 offensive points, you charge somebody or you use your special ability, like for example, Blood Offering, right? And then you still have like 3 attacks, and then you can Adrenaline Rush again for the 4th attack. And this also skill helps with, like, let's say somebody reduces your offensive points on your impressive by 1. Like, you wouldn't be able to attack 5th time with this sort of a skill, with just this one. But if you had, like, the mastery, you would be able to do it. So I think the skill is actually like it has place. I think it's actually good. The question is now if it's like really good or if it's just good. This still costs 6 points to unlock, which is doable for impressives, right? Maybe one more thing. I think the vanilla version of the skill was a bit more based because you would deal 60 damage to yourself, which to me sounds like completely hilarious and awesome. So I kind of like the idea of just being able to kill yourself in vanilla. It's really cool. I'm gonna just like put this into good, and I'll see if I change my mind later based on the other skills. So let's talk about cauterize here. So like in vanilla, cauterize is like a really bad skill. In Paramod, it was kind of bad until it was changed to be able to also remove poisons. And you're also able to remove like the poisons not only from yourself but also from other characters. So you can like build some kind of medic characters who are able to take care of poisons, I guess. And poisons are, I think poisons are like really, really powerful. So being able to remove them is relevant. Um, this sort of a skill, it at the same time, this also costs like 3 strategy points, which is quite a bit. And you're removing just one poison. Another sort of like an interaction for Cauterize is for Doomweaver to remove like the wounds effects from yourself. But also for spellcasters, there's to remove the Globadier skill, which is like the Globe of Silence, right? So overall, I think this is just like not bad because you don't always go against poisons. As for the mastery, I feel like the same kind of situation applies. I think it's also just kind of not bad. You start removing more poisons and more wounds, so it's just like 3 instead of 1. I mean, if you have like points for it, it's easy to master it as well. So I think this is just not bad. But I think this skill is a little bit better because it's gonna be more consistent overall. Okay, the next one we have is exhaustion. So exhaustion is also like I would say it's a good skill. In my experience, you kind of want to use it on spellcasters because you might be like hit by like a Tsinch's, I believe it's called Tsinch's Lash, and it's just going to remove all of your strategy points, so you kind of like move away from your position. With this skill, you are able to regain 1 SP and you can move somewhere into the cover with your casters. This skill is also a sort of a thing I would use on some damage dealers who want to go melee and who really want to close the gap and deal damage to somebody. So this could be somebody like, for example, a lot of the, what do you call them? A lot of chaos units would like this. Uh, as an example, I had like these 2 Marauder characters which I was testing out, and one of them had exhaustion and the other didn't have an exhaustion. And I could feel the difference of like not having exhaustion on that one character. Exhaustion is often like a skill that you just want to use to get your character to safety or to close gap. But I think this is just overall, I guess I can just put it into the really good category. It's definitely better than the Mastered Adrenaline Rush, in my opinion. As for the Exhaustion Mastery, you may be able sometimes to also go for like Exhaustion Mastery, which is gonna give you 2 SP points instead, for 30 health, I mean, wounds. Um, I think this sort of a thing is just mainly used by necromancers, and I don't know like if anybody else would use it really. I guess like spellcasters just to get themselves to safety. But I think most often I saw this on like necromancers and stuff. So I think I'm just gonna like put this along here with Adrenaline Rush. As for the frenzy, unmastered frenzy. It gives you basically 15% damage and 15% magic resistance. But at the cost that you're not able to use stances anymore. I wouldn't use this sort of a skill on what do you call them? Like henchmen. Because I think it just costs too much strategy points in order to like activate it. Um at the same time you don't really also have like a chance to stack up that much magic resistant on something like henchmen and stuff. I think overall it just kind of winds up being like a very okay skill. As for the frenzy mastery, I think this is gonna be like either really good or good. Like damage wise, it's gonna be 30% damage increase for melee attacks and 30% magic resistant. Yeah, I guess that's like a fair point. It definitely is like magic resistance, like some kind of like a stance. But I think it's just gonna be if you're gonna go frenzy, I think you're like supposed to go more deep with the skill and like getting more magic resistance for your warriors is better overall. It's gonna be more consistent overall. And this sort of a skill I would probably use on impressives. I like using this on something like the ogre, and that's about it. Oh, not also the ogre. It's also pretty good in my opinion on what do you call them? The Templar Knights. It's also pretty good on Templar Knights because with witch hunters you're able to stack up quite a bit of magic resistance. And this sort of a skill also goes really well with heavy armor units because magic damage is a counter to heavy armor. So having like magic resistance is very good for highly armored targets because you're just gonna be taking reduced damage from attacks from because of your armor, right? So I think this just kind of like ends up being good, and I think it kind of ends up being at the bottom, at the top of good. I would like think like something like this again. Now the question is like if this is better or if this is better. I think I'm just gonna like leave it like this for now. Oh, Hardy. Okay, so Hardy Unmastered is gonna give you 20 wounds. But it's actually gonna give you more wounds based on the toughness, because your toughness is gonna give you like a wound modifier, which is going to increase that wound value. I think I think it's actually kind of good, but you have to understand that like just having more health and more wounds is not going to win you the game. What is most often going to win you the game is killing the enemy. Yeah? But the good thing about the wounds is that it's like a universal defense against everything. So you can't really go wrong with it. So I think the sort of a skill like belongs here. As for the Hardy Mastery, um, So Hardy Mastery you can only do with 15 toughness. And it's gonna give you 60 health. But it's obviously also going to give you more health because you're going to have 15 toughness. And you can also like gain something like you can also go like 20 toughness with characters, and it's gonna be able to stack like even better. You can also take this sort of a thing on tanky, what do you call them? On tanky impressives, right? And they have like even better health scaling than other characters. And 60 health is like a very big it can be a very big difference maker in fights. So I think this sort of a skill just ends up being really good because it makes your units last longer. However, as I was saying, like this is not like a sort of a skill that's just going to win you more games. You need to like kill people. One more thing about this, it's also that it makes your units like survive more damage in PvE, so they last longer. So this can be also like a difference maker between like your unit going down or like staying alive. Oh, okay. So ignore pain. I think the skill is just like overall not good enough. I can see maybe like trying to go for some kind of a build for a henchman which would focus on armor, and I guess it would be something like a warrior and you would try to stack as much armor as possible. But I think overall just kind of ends up being like very mediocre. And also, like this sort of a skill, you kind of want to be using on a melee character because it doesn't make sense to use it on like a range character, right? But it costs like 2 SP. So it's also kind of like awkward in that sense that as a melee character, you also need your SP to close the gap with the enemy. So it may be just a little bit difficult to sometimes like even be able to use it. So I think this sort of a skill just kind of ends up being just bad, and I don't think you should go for this ever. On the other hand, this skill, it's actually gonna be like 10% armor for 3 rounds at a cost of 10 wounds. So this one actually like ends up being good. Um, because well, stacking armor is good, and the more armor you have, the more unkillable you become. Like you can like make some sort of a character who has you're able to create characters which have like 95% armor, and then they take like 5 or like 10 or like 1 damage from melee attacks or like ranged attacks, and it's kind of crazy. So I think this sort of a skill just ends up being good. Again, it may be like sometimes awkward to try to activate it, but because this lasts 3 rounds instead of like 2 rounds, it ends up being like much better overall. And you can also use it while using frenzy. So that's also like another good thing about this skill. So I'm just gonna like put this like here ish. Oh, intensity. Um, hmm. I think the skill is like really, 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 really freaking good. And there are like a bunch of reasons. So first of all, this skill is easy to master. So that means you don't have to use any points whatsoever to get it. The other good reason why this skill is so good is that it's like an active skill. And usually, passive skills in this game are overall better than the active skills. So with a lot of characters, you end up with a lot of open slots for active skills. So you can just fill them up, for example, with intensity and also like swift jump. Another reason why the skill is very, very good, that it's not just the increase of 15%, what do you call it? Like 15% jumping. Okay, let me check. The athletic tests. Like you get like climb, leap, and jump down tests by 15% for 2 turns. Um, So it's not the only use for this skill. You can also use this skill to close the gap. Like sometimes you're like 1 centimeter away from word zone, and you end up in like a sort of a situation where you have to use like one additional strategy point in order to grab that word zone. But with intensity, you can just like you can inch closer. You can just use this skill to inch without like losing your strategy point. So in this way, this skill kind of ends up being kind of like exhaustion, right? Or you may be like in a situation where you're like 1 centimeter away from the jump down point. You can use this, and just get closer. It's also relevant when you are trying to climb up, right? Like 15% is extremely relevant when you want to climb up. Another use for this skill is that you can also use it to break ambushes, right? Imagine you're like in a sort of a situation where you're just at a corner against the enemy, where the enemy has like an ambush prepared, right? So what you can do is you can get to that corner, you can use intensity to set up like a new strategy point. You can like go like inch a little bit forward. Um, you can inch a little bit forward from the corner to see the enemy, and then you can charge the enemy to break the ambush. So this skill just ends up being so incredibly flexible, and it barely costs you anything. Let me just see how much it costs. It only costs 5 wounds, which is nothing. It's like absolutely nothing. Like it's basically for free. So I think this sort of a skill just ends up being like god tier, and it's also like arguably even better than adrenaline rush. It's definitely better. It's definitely better than exhaustion, actually, in my opinion. As for the mastery, um, so you take intensity because it doesn't cost anything. But mastery intensity, I think it costs only. I think it's easy to master, right? Yes, it's easy to master. I mean, that kind of like defeats the purpose of this skill. Like, I don't think it's. You would rather invest into something else. There is also like a funny thing that this basic skill it only lasts for 2 turns. So you are able to use it more often to cheat some strategy points rather than the mastery intensity, which lasts for 3 turns. And you would prefer using like intensity like every second turn rather than every third turn. The 30% athletic test, I don't think it's relevant enough. So I think this skill just kind of ends up being. I think this kind of skill just ends up being kind of bad. because in the end it hurts you. You want to be able to use intensity as much as possible. But with the mastery intensity, you kind of lose that. So quick recovery gives you basically when you get up from a stun, you don't lose your 2 offense points and 2 strategy points. You also get +5 to the maximum of your martial skills. Um, I think it's actually just kind of good. I think this sort of a skill can be like very nice, for example, for something like casters who would like to invest their like strategy points, who would like to invest their martial points, for example, into like ballistic skills or even like weapon skills for more parry, right? With the stuff and so on. And also like casters may get like stunned. So I think it's like it can be like a good alternative for the casters. This sort of a skill could also be kind of good for henchmen because henchmen have like a limited amount of skills. Hmm. No, they have like a limited amount of offensive points and strategy points. So having your henchman getting stunned and losing those points can be like it can be brutal. And also it is a sort of a way for your henchman to acquire more parry by being able to invest those points instead of accuracy into the parry, into the weapon skill. So if we like think about this sort of skill as like this is also like a higher hit chance and it gets rid of like irrelevant crit. I think it kind of ends up being good. So mastery. The mastery of the skill also gives you 5 martial skills, right? Sorry, martial points. Yeah, martial points that you can distribute however you want. For some character archetypes, such as what do you call her? For the crit smuggler, this sort of a skill ends up being a necessity. Because she needs like those points for the accuracy and so on. Like usually you just want to rely on your normal points and like stats, right? So in that sense, it's kind of like bad. You don't really want to use like your points on something just to get like more stats. I don't know if that makes sense. Okay, I think just overall, I think this just kind of ends up being like not bad because this sort of a skill is a necessity for some builds. Um, so yeah, and also like the requirement is like incredibly easy to fulfill. Like most of the characters in Mordheim just go 9 toughness, so it's like it's incredibly easy to fulfill. So I think like not bad is just like a fair assessment of the skill. Okay. As for the resilient, so resilient unmastered gives you 10% crit resistance. But you can often also get that 10% crit resistance from the lucky enchantment on your weapon, your one-handed melee weapon, or you could get on your two-handed melee weapon plus 20% crit resist. Um, so overall, where would I put this skill? Okay, let's assume there is not a world where the lucky enchantment exists. I think this skill would probably be like God tier, right? But because there are alternatives, like the lucky rune, I think the skill just kind of like ends up being good overall. I think the skill is like a necessity for some characters who just don't have enough toughness, so that you don't keep getting like critted all over again and again. This is like melee characters and so on. But you would prefer to solve that issue with the lucky rune because it's just much cheaper than investing into all of your characters with resilient. And getting resilient on your entire team is like incredibly costly. So it can be kind of like awkward trying to get this skill going on your team. This sort of skill also just ends up being a necessity for well, not necessarily a necessity because the lucky rune exists, but critical resistance is also a stat that you want to get on your armor, because if you're getting critted, crits in Mordheim pierce armor. They completely ignore armor. So critical resistance is like a very important stat also for the heavy armor dudes. So I think it just kind of like ends up being overall good. Or is it like really good? I think I'm just gonna like put it to good. Okay, as for the mastery gives, I believe, 30% crit resistance. And um I don't think it's like an overkill. Like in Mordheim Paramod, like some characters are even able to get over 100% crit chance in certain scenarios and with certain buffs. So like this can be incredibly relevant for the absolutely heaviest armor builds, something like a wolf priest, as an example. Um, at the same time, it can be like also like often an overkill, and it just kind of like winds up doing kind of nothing. This sort of skill is also like sort of good against ghouls or against effects which reduce crit resistance, or also like against effects which stun you, because when you're stunned, people have plus 20% chance to crit you. So it's also like good in that sense. Um, but it may be like very often also like you may have a hard time finding like passive slots to have this sort of a skill in your warband. Mm. So I think this sort of a skill just ends up being at like not bad, but like at the top of the not bad. Oh, so resist poison. So resist poison gives you 20% poison resistance. And it's also like a very specific counter against Skaven, and it can be also relevant against mutations. And it can be also relevant against, what do you call him? The Nurgle guy. um, hmm. It can be relevant against the Nurgle guy because the Nurgle guy, when he hits you, he also reduces your poison resistance. And then it's just like your poison resistance keeps getting reduced and reduced. Um, hmm. This is also like a passive skill, so you usually want to have something more of a general defense overall. And if you really want to counter like poison, you can also just use instead like a shield for 30% poison resistance, or you could also use something like a head enchantment. And head enchantment is gonna give you 40% poison resistance, right? And like once you don't need that poison resistance, you can just change your headgear. and deal with it like in that way. So I think like resist poison ends up being mm, I think it kind of just ends up being like bad. It's definitely better than like ignore pain here. As for the mastery, I think mastery is a lot more relevant because it's gonna give you like 60% poison resistance. And that is indeed like a lot more relevant, especially for something like impressives. There are some like incredibly powerful poison builds, and just being able to resist that poison can be a huge deal for impressives especially. So I think this is definitely usable on something like impressives. I don't think I would use this on anything else. This also like stacks nicely with impressives, with large impressives, because large impressives they get naturally plus 30% poison resistance. So this is like it stacks up really nicely. So your character usually just ends up being immune to poison. So, is this good or is this like not? I think this kind of also just ends up being good because it's also like easy to master. If this wasn't easy to master, I think the skill would be kind of yeah, yeah. This sort of skill just kind of ends up being bad. Okay, unstoppable. So unstoppable gives you 15% stun resist. So unstoppable I think just kind of ends up being bad because 15% stun resist is just not enough. And if you're gonna be investing into stun resist with your characters, you usually just want to get 100% stun resistance with your characters. Uh, because you'd rather be immune to stuns than like play a roulette of if you're gonna get stunned or not. Okay. Also, the mastery of the mastery of Unstoppable gives you 45% stun resistance. It's it's actually much better because with Unstoppable, it is more realistic for you and for your characters to achieve 100% stun resistance, and this can be like very relevant for casters. I would consider this sort of a skill to get for well, I always like get this sort of a skill on a Doomweaver which wants to cast a lot because like Doomweaver is going to just stun himself otherwise. So the question is if it's like not bad or like good. I think it's at the bottom of good. It's also going to like what also Unstoppable does, it also gives you a possibility to not invest into more toughness or like a possibility to not invest into resilient because you're already fine with Unstoppable. Like the worst thing about like crits in Mordheim is getting stunned and like getting like an automatic hit against you. And the worst thing, the absolute worst thing about stuns is losing that those 2 offense points and 2 strategy points. And uh, what would I say? Yeah, Doomweaver just kind of like he likes stunning himself a lot. So yeah, but the only reason like why this is in like good tier, I would just use this on like a Doomweaver. If Doomweaver didn't exist, where would I put this? Maybe like okay. But I think because like Doomweaver exists and it like fits Doomweaver so well, Like for me, it just kind of ends up being good. Oh, veteran. So veteran is like so much of a better skill than the bait that was in vanilla. In vanilla, this was like a truly horrendous skill because it costs a lot of money, and it also costs. Well, the requirement was like nine toughness. And what the veteran would do is that you would have like a chance to not get injured multiple times, just like once, I believe that's the case. In Paramod, the skill gives exactly that, plus also the bonus that you get +2 to your stats, like the maximum of your stats, unmastered. And this can be like very relevant for a lot of characters. Um, there are some characters which like open, end up with like open passive slots. So it can be nice for them to be able to like, for example, use those accuracy points into more weapon skill, as an example. And this skill also doesn't cost anything. So I think this skill just kind of like ends up being overall good. But I think it should be like more at the top. Maybe even like before resilient, really. As for the veteran mastery in Paramount, in vanilla this was just like a complete joke and a complete bait. Okay, how to know like that this skill was horrible in vanilla? So I built this this skill on like possessed, and the first time like my possessed went out, he got an injury. So you're like not immune to injuries, you still may get messed up. In Paramount, the mastery costs 4 points, and you may be able you will get like for the martial points, for the mental points, and for the physical points, you get +2 to everything. I think this sort of a skill is very overrated, and I wouldn't like. I don't think it's a good idea to use it. Some people use like veteran to get to be able to get like the mastery of veteran in order to be able to get 15 strength and 15 toughness on certain characters in order to be able to use armor proficient and the mastery of hardy. So I think in that sense, this sort of skill kind of just ends up being I think this sort of skill just kind of ends up being bad. Because for a lot of these characters, we can instead just use what do you call it? Um, we can use like knowledge Mordheim instead of armor proficient as like an alternative. Or also think about it, like if you use veteran and at the same time armor proficient, in that case your armor proficient didn't cost you 6 points to get, but it actually cost you 10 points in total because you also had to get the veteran, right? So I think this just kind of like ends up being bait, and you should like rely more on the what do you call it? Uh, you should rely more on the natural points that you gain. You could also like use this sort of a skill on a champion in order to get both this skill and the armor proficient. In that case, I usually just go for just like the basic hardy for the champion and just kind of abandon the idea of master veteran. I think this skill just doesn't do enough for 4 points. I think the skill just kind of ends up being like okay. Like this. And I think that's it.